everybody. Well, my job this morning is in 20 minutes or less to explain everything about MS. I heard that. All kidding aside, what I'm going to try to do briefly is to go over the basics of multiple sclerosis. Some of the questions you might have, especially for those of you who are newly diagnosed, or for those of you who are like family and come to every seminar. You guys have heard this a million times already, right? So, but reviews never a bad thing. I'm going to tell you a little bit about MS. I'm going to concentrate on telling you about MS. I don't think I'm going to have time to get much into the treatments today, but I will do the best I can. So let's see if this thing. Okay, I think we found it. Okay, so the most basic question is, what is multiple sclerosis anyway? The way I usually explain it to people is that the same immune system that you depend on to fight infections all of a sudden decides to fight the insulation around your nerves. Your nerves are exactly like electrical wires. There's wiring on the inside, and there's insulation on the outside. And the insulation on the outside is called myelin. Multiple sclerosis is caused by your immune system attacking some component of the myelin, of the insulation around the nerve. The reason it has its name is pretty simple. Sclerosis is a scar, and generally when we see them, they are multiple in the brain. So pretty simple name, multiple sclerosis, multiple scars. It tells you what the disorder does. We know so much about multiple sclerosis, but we still don't know what triggers it. There's much research going on in this regard, and we can tell you all about what the immune system does in multiple sclerosis, but we don't know what triggers it. And the leading theories are what I have listed on the slide up there. We think there may be environmental, viral, or even ethnic or other hereditary causes for multiple sclerosis. So attacking environmental first, well, there are some very interesting things that we notice about multiple sclerosis. We notice that multiple sclerosis tends to be a disease of temperate climates. So places like the northern United States, places. Okay, so places like Europe, typically. And even in this country, one of the interesting things we see is that the further north you go, the more likely you are to see people with multiple sclerosis. So what it indicates is that maybe there's something environmental that makes MS more likely in those locations. There's a town in Lorain County where there was a larger number of people than would be expected with multiple sclerosis, and that's led to some years of study of the old factory that was once in operation there, looking for potential toxins that could trigger an immune response. We don't have definite answers from that yet, but again, when we see a cluster of multiple sclerosis like that, it makes us think. Another example of this is in the Faroe Islands. This is a small group of islands in the South Atlantic, in the Atlantic Ocean, under British rule. After World War II, there was an epidemic of multiple sclerosis. There were more people than you would expect with this condition from that island. And so the question becomes, is there something local that would cause this? Now some people think that there could be a viral cause for multiple sclerosis. And the reason to think that is because there are many viral illnesses that manifest in a way that looks like multiple sclerosis. So for example, HIV. HIV can cause okay.
That better?
No.
It is now.
Okay. Better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So back to viral illnesses. HIV can cause scars inside the brain that look a lot like multiple sclerosis. And in fact, anyone who comes to my office with MS-like symptoms, I often will do an HIV test unless they're in the risk factors. There are other viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mono, which you guys have heard of it as the kissing disease, I'm sure. That can manifest. Measles can sometimes manifest with scars inside the brain that look a lot like multiple sclerosis. So because of this, people are thinking, well, is there a virus that we just haven't discovered yet that triggers multiple sclerosis? And if there is, maybe it also explains these clusters of MS that we see. Next is and last is ethnic and genetic factors. We thought in the past that multiple sclerosis was primarily a disease of Caucasians. As it turns out, anybody can develop multiple sclerosis. There are some populations that seem protected, though. For example, people from Japan seem to be protected. But here's the interesting thing: if you're Japanese, born in Japan, and emigrate to the United States before age 15, then you become as likely to develop multiple sclerosis as if you were born in the United States. But if you're born in Japan and you emigrate to the United States after about age 15, then you keep the same low risk as in Japan. So again, that makes you think: is there an environmental cause? Is there something? Is there something in the environment, something viral, something that we're not sure of that can trigger multiple sclerosis? All right. So enough about that. So common symptoms in multiple sclerosis. Well, the number one symptom in multiple sclerosis is fatigue. Fatigue. And the fatigue can be so severe that you can't get out of bed. And it's not, and it may not be because of because you're weak. You just can't do it. So a message to the loved ones in the audience, those supporting your loved one with multiple sclerosis: if your loved one says that I'm tired and I can't, believe them. They can't. They are not BSing you. They're not BSing you. Even if you have no symptoms of MS, even if you're walking as normal, you're on balance, you have no tingling, no numbness, no nothing, the fatigue can still be there. The fatigue can still be there. So just, I mention that at every seminar as something to keep in mind. But the other symptoms that go along with MS, they're pretty straightforward, and it all depends on what part of the brain is involved. If one of the parts of the brain that controls muscle function is affected, then you may have weakness of one limb or both legs if it's the spinal cord, or one side of the body if it's on the opposite side of the brain. If there's a portion of the brain or the spinal cord that controls the sensation involved, then you may have tingling, numbness, burning. You can have any abnormal sensation that you don't want. And typically, depending on where the scar is, if it's on one side of the brain, it'll involve the opposite side of the body. If it's in the spinal cord, that is the bundle of nerves in your spine, it'll involve either both legs, or if it's high enough, it'll involve both your legs and your arms at the same time. If the portion of the brain at the back that helps to control your balance is involved, then you'll be off balance. And that's really a common symptom. There's optic neuritis. Optic neuritis is inflammation of the myelin, the insulation around your optic nerve. That's the nerve that carries information from your eye back into your brain. And when that happens, we call it optic neuritis, and it manifests with blurred vision in one eye, or even blindness in one eye. Rarely it can affect both eyes at the same time. Typically, it's one side. Then we have diplopia, double vision. Sorry, I used medicalese there for a minute. Please don't kill me. So true double vision, where you're seeing two of things, that can happen because of involvement of the nerves that control your vision. It makes your eyes misalign. And then of course, bladder problems. That's a really big issue, and it tends to affect people who have problems with the spinal cord, with the multiple sclerosis. And it can be anything from urinary incontinence to urinary retention. Urinary retention, where you're holding in urine and you can't pee it out. And it's pretty painful. That can be pretty painful. I'm sure it's happened to somebody in this room, and you've had to have a catheter inserted to drain off the urine. And the other way it manifests is with urine infections, and those urine infections can be fairly frequent because of this problem. And the last thing to mention, heat sensitivity. So how many of you in the audience with multiple sclerosis get into a hot tub and you feel your symptoms getting worse? Or if it's 95 degrees outside, which doesn't happen that often in Cleveland, but it does happen. It's 95 degrees and you step outside and you feel that weak leg just getting weaker. That's heat sensitivity, and some people are really sensitive to that. And it's for that reason that for the people I see who are susceptible to it, usually about this time of year, I'm breaking out the prescription pad and writing prescription for cooling vests, because for someone who wants to go outside in warm weather and you're heat sensitive, you have to do something to cool off. So for the loved ones in the audience, if your loved one with MS says, it's too hot outside, it's gonna make me worse, once again, believe them. It's true. It really happens. All right. So how do we classify multiple sclerosis? So when doctors talk about multiple sclerosis, we divide it up into several categories. The most common type of multiple sclerosis is relapsing remitting. So that means it relapses, it worsens, and then it remits. It gets better. So relapsing, remitting. Usually better than 70% of people with multiple sclerosis at least start that way. Then we have relapsing progressive, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of people with multiple sclerosis, before the days of our disease-modifying therapies anyway, about 50% of people with MS got that way. So you relapse, and then you get better, but not quite back to where you were. Relapse, improve, but not quite back to where you were. And so overall, there's a decline over time. That makes up about 15% of people overall with multiple sclerosis. And then there's primary progressive multiple sclerosis. Primary progressive multiple sclerosis tends to manifest in people who are older, and by older, I mean people in their 30s and 40s typically. the older you are, when you manifest first with multiple sclerosis, the more likely you are to have primary progressive. The younger you are with MS, the more likely you are to have relapsing remitting, which we think has a better prognosis. So this is how we classify multiple sclerosis. There's one MS-like syndrome that I will mention as well, called Devick's syndrome. Devick's syndrome is another form of demyelination, that is stripping of the myelin around the insulation around the nerves. That is much more severe than usual. Typically, it will manifest with optic neuritis, so blurred vision, and spinal cord problems. So people become off balance or less able to walk. And an interesting thing about this is that African Americans are, in theory, less likely to develop multiple sclerosis, but when they get it, they're more likely to have it more severely, and they're also more likely to develop this Devick's syndrome as well. We don't know why that is, and there has been some research done on potential reasons. Often we think of African Americans as having less access to medical care, but in this case, if you can't walk, or if you're tingling, or if you're blind in one eye, everybody goes to the doctor. Almost everybody has sense enough to go to the doctor to get that figured out in a timely fashion. So we know that the problem is not access to care. And so that goes back to, is there something environmental? Is there something hereditary? Again, these are things that are still being worked out. We don't know the answers yet. They will come. All right. So who's at risk for multiple sclerosis? Well, typically this is a disease of the young. But I will tell you, we can see MS in even teenagers or even small children. It's not common, but we can see it. And the oldest person I diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in my practice was 74. Though, as it turns out, she had been having symptoms that were relatively minor, and she kind of blew them off. Okay, my vision was blurred for a couple of days, and then it went away. So I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to bother my doctor about it. So it's that sort of thing. If you're getting that kind of thing on a fairly regular basis, that's something to ask your doc about. And I've already mentioned that people who are older tend to develop, and when they first develop symptoms. I'm not talking about the person who's had symptoms for a long time and finally they're diagnosed. Usually when they have something that looks like a stroke. That's how this 74-year-old person I diagnosed manifested. We thought she had a stroke at first, and we looked at the MRI, and wow, that's not stroke, that's MS. So that's complete accident diagnosis for that lady. Now, women are likelier to have multiple sclerosis, and again, we don't know why. There are a few guesses. As the ladies might guess, the guesses mostly center around hormones. They mostly center around hormones. We're not 100% sure how that is related, but again, there's ongoing research. Thank you. So how do we make the diagnosis? Well, mostly, and this is true of most diseases in neurology. We make the diagnosis by listening to you. Usually by the time someone gets to the neurologist, they've had sometimes more than one spell. And so if we talk to you and we get a history that sounds like more than one episode involving more than one part of the brain, then we know by the end of 2 minutes with you that we're ordering an MRI of the brain already. Okay? So mostly we're listening to you. We're listening to what sort of symptoms you have. And we do a neurological examination. So everybody in the audience with MS knows what that means. All of that, Oh, that's right, and the famous poking with the needle, yes. Yes, that too. So. So it all looks and feels strange to you, but as it turns out, there's organization to it, and each of those little tests looks at a different part of your brain or your spinal cord, and what it tells me as a neurologist is where the problem is in the nervous system, and at the end, if I decide, well, maybe this looks like multiple sclerosis, it also tells me what part of your nervous system I'm going to order an MRI for, whether it's your brain or your neck or your spine. Now, as far as, thank you. There are, in addition to the neurological examination, there are some laboratory tests that we can do as well. Someone who has MS-like symptoms, at the same time I'm ordering the MRI of the brain, I'm also ordering studies to look for other immune system diseases. I have, for example, lupus is a disease where your immune system affects your connective tissues, the tissues that connect muscles to bone, muscles to each other, that line your organs, things like that. And people with lupus can develop scars in their brain that look just like multiple sclerosis. And so it's really important to look for other immune diseases because the treatment's a little different from multiple sclerosis. Before we say you've got multiple sclerosis, we want to be right. We also test for various things like Lyme disease. Lyme disease is not really a big diagnosis here in Cleveland, but we typically think of it in people who have outside pets, people who are outdoors a lot, people who work outdoors, and that's because it's really easy to miss Lyme disease. With Lyme disease, tick bites you, they release an organism, the organism causes big red splotches on you, and it's really to look at the splotches and say, no big deal, I'm going to ignore it because they don't hurt. And with time, the infection continues, and ultimately you develop something called tertiary Lyme. So in the late stages of Lyme disease, you develop symptoms that look a lot like multiple sclerosis, and you may develop scars in the brain that look a lot like multiple sclerosis. So we try to get ahead of that by ordering Lyme titers. I've already mentioned HIV, and in people who have had symptoms in the past that sound like mono, I'll also order the Epstein-Barr virus. We can actually look for that in the blood. Sarcoidosis is a condition in which you develop big balls of immune reaction, typically in the lungs. In about 5% of people, it affects the brain too. Usually MRI rules that out. And if the MRI is suggestive of multiple sclerosis, we look for, we also do a spinal tap. Not everybody gets a spinal tap. Usually I still do them. What we're looking for is evidence for an immune response in your central nervous system, and the easiest way to do that is to take some of your spinal fluid, because if there's an immune response in your nervous system, it'll be evident in your spinal fluid. So that's why we subject you to that test. Now next is what the MRI looks like. So this is what we see on the MRI. This is one example. The arrows point to those big white areas. Those are areas of scar from multiple sclerosis, and they typically they're close to the ventricles, the fluid-filled spaces inside the brain, but they don't have to be. A lot of people who have only one symptom to go along with their multiple sclerosis, if there's only one symptom, and we get the MRI and it looks like that, and there are multiple lesions, that pretty much makes the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis for us. And I say that to tell you that MRI was one of the biggest advances in diagnosing multiple sclerosis, because before the late 80s, when MRI started becoming more available, we depended more on the lumbar puncture and more on talking to you. Now that we have MRI, now we can show you what's causing the problems on your neurological examination. So that is the enemy. All right. So just a couple of items about treatment.
We're going to give you a chance to ask questions.
And I'm almost done. This is just a couple of minutes because we want to keep on time. When I started medical school at Case in 1990. When I started medical school, we had nothing for multiple sclerosis. Basically, you saw the neurologist, and they offered steroids for when you had a flare up, and we didn't, and that was it. Now, while I was in medical school, now we call them disease-modifying therapies, but the first preventive treatment for multiple sclerosis came while I was in medical school, and that was beta-seron, which probably some of you guys are on. Beta-seron is the oldest of the disease-modifying therapies, and we know it works. We know it works really well. It reduces the risk for new plaques by 30%, which compared to having no treatment, pretty dang good. And since then there have been a wide variety of other injectables. So the Avonex, which is similar to but not exactly like beta-seron, the Copaxone, which tricks your immune system into beating up on it rather than on the nerves, the Tysabri, which is an antibody, the Novantrone, which is a chemotherapy agent. So we have all sorts of injectable agents, but now in the last few years, finally we have pills for MS. There are 3 on the market now, and there's another one that's being tested as well that may be on the market shortly, as well. The ones that are on the market are Gilenya, Tecfidera, and Albagio, and many neurologists, myself included, are starting patients who are new to multiple sclerosis on the pills instead of making them inject themselves. And some people who are on the injectables who want a change, we're changing them too. Though honestly, my approach is if your injectable is keeping your MS stable, if it's working, I'm reluctant to rock the boat. I don't want to take any risk. But the reason I bring that up, and I'll finish with this, is that in 26 years we've gone from sorry you've got MS, you're going to be in a wheelchair, to now, my patients always laugh when I say this, but the current approach to MS is to beat it up, beat it down to the ground, kick it, give it a good kicking, do the best we can to kill it. MS is now a chronic manageable disease for most people, especially when we start medication as early. I mean, we know the earlier we start medication, the more likely someone with MS is to go on to lead a normal life. Or close to that. So I'm going to finish on that point, and we'll move back to Kym. And thank you for letting me ramble on.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Just real quick, I want to remind you, make sure you write your questions down. Write them down. We will have a Q&A session, so write them down so you can ask the doctors. Dr. Richardson is on call today, so he may need to kind of bounce in and out. You can go right ahead. you know, information that you can. I want to also thank our presenting sponsors. He said he'll say as long as he can. We want to thank our presenting sponsors, Medical Mutual and PNC, because of their support. We are able to supply to put on these seminars, and we thank you for their support. If we know that Medical Mutual and PNC have been great to us, and we thank them for their support. Just real quick, I wanted to get also our volunteers today. I know I see a couple of faces. Can you show your hands a little bit? I want to say, come on, Nesby, come on. A couple other volunteers, thank you so much for your help, for your support. Sam helps keep us up to date on our Instagram, so yes, we are up to technology now. You always follow us on Instagram and Facebook, that's right, social media is happening. So we thank them, thank you for your help and your support, so we appreciate it. You know, our speaker today was born and raised right here in Cleveland, Ohio. He received his undergraduate degree in biology from Case Western Reserve University in 2003. So he's a baby. He's a baby, so like, I knew that. So his undergraduate thesis focused on mesenchymal stem cells and biology in the laboratories of Dr. Stephen Hainsworth. Also, he went on now to earn his PhD from the University of Oxford, and as a recipient of a prestigious scholarship from the National Institution of Health. He finished his graduate work in just over 3 years and received some of the highest graduate student accolades possible. He continues his studies to develop the cutting edge on stem cells, technology, and he has also been developing treatment of the nervous system disorders, including multiple sclerosis and breast cancer. I could go on and on and on. Dr. Cortez has just really been one of the key individuals that has done a lot of research on stem cells, and hopefully he has some information today that I think will impress all of us. Is it now time to find something to reverse multiple sclerosis? Yes. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Cortez.
Thank you very much, Kym. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to stand up if that's okay for everyone. This fitness app that I have just told me I've been sitting down. So I'm very fortunate to be able to present my work all over the world.